Today, my name is Jared Gostancic. I'm Forrester's National Training Manager. Today's webinar is our Plan Right Underwriting webinar. I'm pleased to be joined with Doug Parrott. He's Forrester's Chief Underwriter. So a couple of things for housekeeping before we begin. Everyone is on mute right now, but I encourage you to ask any questions as we're going through. You can do so on the menu bar. We'll also be doing several polls today. We encourage you to participate. And lastly, we also have several handouts on some of the materials we'll be covering. You can find that information also on the menu bar. So to give you an overview, we'll be talking about Plan Right application, the importance and benefits of full disclosure, medical questions, and prescription history. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Doug and thank him for his time today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're having a great Thursday. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this and to speak with you in this format. And for the next hour, we're going to talk a lot of things Plan Right. So with that being said, let's get right into the agenda and start to talk about the application a little bit. Excuse me. The application, again, our application is set up in a fashion, a section fashion, if you will, that answers will drive certainly to certain products, but sometimes we get questions of why we would ask such a question. But I guess really what I'm going to try to do is to take the application and really go from top to bottom, if you will, discussing the medical questions and the highlights and the comments of those medical questions. So the first section of our application clearly is the part of the application that is the knockout section. Many companies do things in a different way. We have our knockout questions, obviously, and those are the questions 1 through 6 in that first section. Excuse me. One of the questions we get, or one of the challenges we get, I guess, when we talk about, I'm going to go really right to question number 2, is the use of a wheelchair due to a chronic illness or disease. The key in this particular question goes to the notion of a problem that's chronic. A really good example of something that would be a good way to look at this situation is somebody who's had hip surgery, somebody who has had knee surgery or had knees replaced, and they find themselves with the use of a wheelchair. Sometimes we get questions about the use of a scooter. For those particular situations that are not chronic in nature, again, a hip replacement is not chronic, even if both hips are happening over a short period of time. We are really concerned about the wheelchair use in a chronic situation. Now, oftentimes we get questions also with respect to wheelchair use for somebody that uses it in the mall, that they use it, I guess, on excursions that are beyond using it in their home. And we would consider those types of situations, the wheelchair use in that fashion, as a chronic use. So just to be clear on that, we just want to make sure that as far as your work is concerned and what you see out in the field and your field underwriting is concerned, that there's no questions with respect to the term chronic in that particular question. Activities of daily living, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. Generally, don't get too many questions about that, but again, if somebody is coming in the home and helping with those particular issues, that would be consideration of ADL. I know that Medicare right now, and really for the last couple of years perhaps, has been paying medical claims for people, to nurses and those from those types of firms, to come in and do stuff around the house, do the cooking, do the cleaning, do some laundry, that sort of thing. Those are a little bit more of on the fence situation. If you have those situations, we'd love to talk to you about what the actual situation is. But really what we're trying to get to is the medical issue behind what those services might be trying to take care of. So if you have that situation and there is something more than a reason, a medical reason as to why that's happening, we'd love to talk to you about it, and we'll work through it as those things happen. Oxygen equipment used to assist with breathing. Just a clarification, sleep apnea has a couple of different forms of oxygen use. Sometimes oxygenated air is pushed through a CPAP machine, but then there are also times where true oxygen, whole oxygen, is actually being fed through the apparatus for somebody's sleep apnea. If that is anything other than recirculated room air that's going through the CPAP machine or through the oxygenator, then unfortunately that is considered the use of oxygen, and is something that we would look for you to answer yes to on that particular question. Excuse me. Question 3B talks about having surgery, hospitalization, diagnostic tests which haven't been started, completed, or for which results are not yet known. We're talking about specific tests that have been done as a result of a problem that's come up, or something that is trying to be attempting to be followed, or a new diagnosis that's been made. Those are the things that we're talking about. Now, if you are if you have somebody who has a physical or an annual exam that's closer to that application date, and there is a history of some challenges with the exam, that I would encourage you probably to hang on until that exam is completed to make sure that there are no other issues of that exam. But again, this question really is targeting those tests and those diagnostic tests and hospitalizations and doctor's visits and so forth of a new or a followed diagnosis of some significance. Complications, we talk about complications of diabetes a couple of times in this application. One of the knockout questions as far as the application is concerned is an amputation due to complications? Unfortunately, diabetes is not a disease that plays very well with your body or with any other diseases. And once amputations have set in due to neuropathy and actual nerve damage that happens and can happen within diabetes, the diabetes is on a path that there's really no return. And so that's the significance of that particular complication inside of the diabetes family. Now down below we ask about retinopathy and neuropathy, and I know I've talked to many of you about drugs with respect to neuropathy. There's a couple of drugs out there that have dual use. This particular question, as far as the knockout situation is concerned, again, we're just concerned about amputations. Congestive heart failure, I'm going to tackle this one a little bit in this question. We had a question earlier this week when somebody signed up about cardiomyopathy, and I really want to take this opportunity to just tell you what cardiomyopathy is and to explain how it's a very, very close sister to congestive heart failure. Cardiomyopathy is the beginning of the degeneration of the heart muscle as a pump. The heart acts in many different ways. It's an electrical machine. It's got arteries inside of it, so blood flows through the heart muscle to actually give itself fuel and oxygen. And then the heart itself is simply a muscle. And when that muscle starts to be challenged as far as using that muscle as a pump, that is the start of congestive heart failure. And cardiomyopathy really is the start of congestive heart failure. Now, cardiomyopathy may progress to full and complete congestive heart failure, and it may at some point slow its progress. It's a degenerative disease. It won't get better, but it can slow its progress. But it is, for all intents and purposes, it is congestive heart failure. Question 5C, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, been prescribed Aricept, Cognex, donazepam, Exelon, Razidine, or Namenda. The interesting thing about dementia in a very, very, very sad disease for anybody that has it and for folks that you know that might have it, the medication around this disease is pretty self-explanatory and self-telling. Physicians are not very good about documenting in their medical records that somebody has Alzheimer's disease or somebody has dementia. When you get records and you see a person who has this particular history, about 8 times out of 10 you're going to see they have memory problems, they have memory loss, they go to describe situations that the family has documented as far as dad forgot where he lived or mom forgot where the church was, those types of things. Once the medication sets in and the prescriptions are made for these particular medications, and over the course of the last few years, again, a number of medications have been added. Medications I think will probably continue to be added. But once the medications set in, the unfortunate part is that they are at a point where dementia is the diagnosis, despite what the doctor might say in the application. There is no dual use situations that I'm aware of for any of these drugs. They are used for dementia and for memory loss. And so when we see these drugs and those drugs come up in prescription history, unfortunately, we only have one path, and that path would be to knock them out for our Plan Right product. And then lastly, question 6 simply is about a question with respect to multiple, more than one occurrence of cancer, same or different type. When one has a cancer diagnosis, unfortunately, you have a significantly high chance to contract cancer, again, either the same type or another type of cancer. Those are just the statistics. Now, fortunately, there's a number of people that never get cancer again, and they've only had to deal with it once. But unfortunately, as far as the law of large numbers are concerned, and the statistics that we see from the CDC and the American Cancer Society and the research that's done within the reinsurance companies, anybody who has had cancer once has a significant chance of getting cancer again. And so that's why we don't act on somebody who has had cancer other than within our look-back period. But if you've been diagnosed with cancer more than once, unfortunately, again, we only have one path to take. I'm going to try to, questions we have some questions coming in. We'll try to answer as many of these as we can. One question, and it's a really good question, and I'm going to tackle this one right now, if you don't mind. The question is why we won't write this product for people under the age of 50. And the answer to that, quite honestly, is the mortality for people under the age of 50 in this product, in this market, is significantly terrible. I have been in the final expense business for about 12 years now. And for those that are under the age of 50 who are looking to buy a final expense product, there's really only one reason why they're trying to buy it, because they need it. It's not a good planning exercise. This is expensive insurance, even at that age. And so typically the reason that folks are looking for this type of product at that age is because they actually need it medically. We can't price this high enough to cover the mortality of somebody under the age of 50. And so as a course of all of those comments, that's the reason that we don't write this product under the age of 50. We're going to get into Part B a little bit now. I'm going to go right to question 1A, have you used illegal drugs? I'm not sure that it pertains so much to this market, maybe just a little bit. But as you know, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, District of Columbia, a number of other states have legalized marijuana. Marijuana, just because the state has legalized it, doesn't mean that the mortality effects of marijuana have changed. As a matter of fact, right now the reinsurance companies are doing a number of studies on the marijuana use and the THC levels, and whether we think that that's good or bad. And really, I think they're kind of opening this up again because a number of states have made this a legal drug. So in those states where this is a legal drug and your customer is using marijuana, to be quite honest with you, they can answer that question honestly now, no. If they're in the state of Colorado, Washington, Oregon, District of Columbia, and a couple of others that I'm forgetting. I think over time, probably what will happen is the reinsurance community will lighten up a little bit on marijuana use, but I think it will take some time. But for our purposes, for this particular product, for somebody using marijuana now in those states that have legalized it, they can honestly answer that question no. 1B goes to the complications of diabetes that we've talked about a little bit up above. These are really more common complications of diabetes: diabetic coma, insulin shock, retinopathy, nephropathy, and neuropathy. Neuropathy and retinopathy probably are the two most popular. Retinopathy is kind of a no-brainer because there doesn't appear to be dual-use drugs with respect to retinopathy as a result of a diabetic complication. Neuropathy, many conversations with many of you with respect to the drugs that are available and that are being used for neuropathy and for their dual purpose. Gabapentin is one of them, Lyrica is one of them, just to name a couple of those drugs. Our drug rules, as we go through our prescription history engine, if it sees a diabetes drug, metformin, any of the oral meds or insulin, and then it sees a neuropathy drug, gabapentin, Lyrica, it will make, based on the rules, and again, rules are black and white, they're not gray, and there's no underwriting intervention inside of drug rules, it will make the decision that that person has neuropathy and will return a decision to Aptical that says this is a complication of diabetes and here's the appropriate product decision. Now, I've had conversations again either directly on the phone or through email with a number of you with respect to that. If what we do is we look back at the drugs and the age or how long the drug has been used. I know that I've had some situations where, yeah, it makes sense in terms of what I'm being told. As far as the drug is concerned, that it isn't neuropathy. Gabapentin, I've seen other indications that there's an epilepsy situation out there, so that makes a lot of sense. But there are times when that history is not clear enough, and unfortunately we just need some medical confirmation that they don't have neuropathy. I know recently I've looked at one where there was a history of gabapentin, and prior to that the history was Lyrica. And so despite the information that we received, unfortunately that's a situation where we ask for a medical confirmation that the applicant does not have neuropathy. Stroke and TIAs, I think pretty self-explanatory. Again, this has a 2-year look back, and so that's really what we're looking for. Somebody that had a stroke or had TIAs 5 years back that are even perhaps probably still on medication, probably on Plavix or warfarin or something similar. If they're outside of our look-back period and there's no issues, no challenges, no new symptoms, no new testing, that really isn't an issue for us. Brain tumor or aneurysm, don't see a lot of it. I'm sure it happens. We just don't see a lot of it in the final expense world. The brain tumor or aneurysm generally tends to be a little bit younger person's problem, but it can, especially in the 50s and early 60s, it still can show up as an issue. And then our cancer question, our three-year look back on our cancer question. Again, other than basal cell, the cancer treatment must be outside of that 3-year period for us to consider for us to consider this particular question and the product related to this section. Oftentimes, for example, I'm going to give you a breast cancer example. Somebody had been treated for breast cancer, they had surgery, perhaps had radiation or chemo and radiation, and they're 4 years treatment-free. They might still be on tamoxifen. We would consider the tamoxifen, if the first fill of the tamoxifen is beyond our look-back period, we would consider that to be a maintenance drug. And we would, in those particular situations, you could answer this question no. If we see in our prescription history, however, that the tamoxifen was taken and let's say there was a break in that drug fill a year and a half ago, and it went 6 months or 9 months and there was no fills, and then all of a sudden started up again, we would consider that to be a new fill and a new cancer problem. With respect to marijuana use, this person's question is somebody using medical or medicinal marijuana and it is not legal in the state in which they're using it. The challenge for us there is to understand why they're using it. So please be extremely honest about that particular reason. There are a number of different reasons medical marijuana is prescribed. Cancer is one significant reason why it's prescribed, and the pain of cancer that is being treated and ongoing. Sometimes there are some very severe arthritis situations in which it's being used as well. But we would ask you to be extremely honest with us with respect to the reason why the medical marijuana is being used. Okay. You see in your screens that we're doing some polling, and we would ask you to be honest with that with respect to the questions, and take a couple of seconds to answer those polls if they come up. It helps us to understand our audience and helps us to know who you are and what your background is, and not only for this particular webinar, but for future webinars. So we appreciate you taking just a few seconds to answer these polls as they come across. Okay. All right. I can see the application screen again. There we go. All right. We're going to talk about Section C now. Section C has some questions that are very specific to the problem, but there's a couple of situations we're going to talk about. Parkinson's disease. Requip is one of those dual-use drugs that causes many of us grief from time to time. Again, the medical community in their work, the FDA approves drugs for certain things, but the medical community can legally, and obviously does, determines other uses for drugs. The unfortunate part is that there's not very much information and there's no real good source to understand what those drugs are being used for on a dual basis. So we find out by trial and error, we find out through our own research, through our own medical directors, and any information that they can get from colleagues and other places. We find out once in a while through APSs and find out that a certain drug is being prescribed for this particular problem, so we kind of park that information back in our databases and use it as we can. But I know that, like I said, Requip was probably one of the first drugs that came up a number of years ago for dual purpose use, and at the time it caused everybody a lot of grief. But Requip, again, it's used for restless leg syndrome. It's also used for Parkinson's disease. So just be cognizant of those particular situations with a dual use purpose. Systemic lupus, there's two types of lupus. There's discoid lupus and there's systemic lupus. The notion of lupus, or the diagnosis of lupus, doesn't give us quite enough information. We really need to know what type of lupus it is. Your customers should absolutely know what type of lupus it is. Discoid is sort of a non-eventful lupus. If they have systemic lupus, it'll be significant with medications and treatments and follow-ups and so forth. Liver or kidney disease or condition. Chronic hep, we highlight chronic hepatitis or cirrhosis of the liver. Liver disease is really kind of a no-brainer. The unfortunate part is we all have one liver and we need it. We can't live without it. And so any liver disease tends to be very, very much of a problem. There really is no benign liver disease. Liver disease usually comes in the form of cirrhosis and is actually very, very bad. Kidney disease, rather, is a little bit different. Obviously, we have two kidneys. We only need one. But kidney disease can come in the form of acute kidney disease or chronic kidney disease. And what's more, chronic kidney disease is staged at 5 grades. And so stage 1 chronic kidney disease is not nearly as bad as stage 5 chronic kidney disease. So when it comes to those particular situations, for our purposes, we kind of lump them all together. But it's important to note somebody being treated for kidney disease. It's very important that we know that. We will probably find out about it through prescription history, but please be good field underwriters and help us to understand if that is something your customer is going through. COPD is the generic Kleenex term for all things bad that are respiratory in nature. COPD is not asthma, and asthma is not COPD. And unfortunately, oftentimes, asthma drugs are used for COPD, and COPD drugs are used for asthma. And our challenge is really more on the side of COPD drugs being used for asthma. Spiriva is generally, almost without question, a COPD drug and used for COPD. But again, our challenge comes from the drugs of COPD and trying to determine that that person really has COPD or if they have asthma. So anything that you can do to be specific with us with respect to the medications would be most helpful in our underwriting this product for you, and hopefully not having to tap you on the shoulder on the backside and forcing you to go find some more information or some additional information. Again, chronic bronchitis and emphysema are very specific. They're treated very specifically, and they are what they are. I do want to take, just based on the medication comments that we've made throughout this part of the application, I want to talk about prescription history just a little bit. The challenge of prescription history, first of all, let me just tell you kind of a little bit of what that's about. There are 2 firms in this country that go get prescription history records. Milliman and IntelliScript, which is now owned by Lab 1. Milliman and IntelliScript are the only 2 companies in the country that do this, and we use both of them. Milliman is our primary company, and we use IntelliScript on a secondary basis, but we do use both companies. There's nobody else that does it, and they have PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, and pharmacies and healthcare plans that are contracted with them that allow them to get this information. Our hit rates are in the upper 80% for prescription history, so it's not going to be very common for us not to find out about prescription history that's not out there. So we encourage you to be extremely honest about that. Now, having said that, the real question to ask your customer is not necessarily the drugs that they are taking, but it's the drugs that they have had filled. And I would encourage you to ask your customer to see those prescription bottles, to look through those prescription histories, to see what it is that's actually been filled, because we get fill information. We don't get information that says somebody's taking a drug or not. If a drug has been filled, we assume that that drug is being taken for the purposes that it was prescribed in the first place. A lot of you have come across folks that have either a history of angina or symptoms that would lead one to believe that they may have angina. Nitroglycerin is the drug of choice for that particular problem. Nitro is a drug that is a little bit uncommon to others, in that once that prescription is filled, the hope is that you don't have to use it. And nitro also has sort of a shelf life of about a year. And so if we see somebody that is taking nitroglycerin and there's no more fills for that year, and then the next year they're refilling the nitroglycerin, our assumption is that particular drug has been prescribed for angina, and they're just continuing to refill it as the drug needs to have a new refill. And so we will look at that again. We will look at it based on the fill history and the first fill history, in consideration of using that for consideration of our decision. We'll look at our look back, and if the first fill is beyond our look back, and it's just a continuous schedule of refilling that drug once a year, then we will consider that to be a maintenance drug and act accordingly. If there's a break in fills, obviously, then our decision will be different. What you have in front of you on the screen is the drug list that's part of our underwriting guide inside of the Plan Right Underwriting Guide. There are many, many drugs inside of this, and we continue to look at them, and we refresh this list as often as we can. And for our purposes, I know that the current revision date that's out there is actually 2012. But we have reviewed this again, so we will be making a change to our revision. Possible to put everything out there, but when we look at the drugs that we get from Milliman and from IntelliScript in terms of the drugs that are hit against us the most, that's the basis that we use to make this drug list. So as you can see, just on this particular page, there's 3 or 4 drugs here that are used for dual purposes. So we will, our challenge is to go in and figure out why that drug is being used. And when it comes to congestive heart failure, generally there is not just one drug that's used for congestive heart failure. There's generally multiple drugs. In our prescription history drug rules, we have a combination rule that actually looks for a number of certain things, and when those things fall into line, you can be certain that congestive heart failure is the diagnosis. But again, I encourage you to use this as often as you can. It will give you guidance. It will save you grief on the backside. It will help you to ask questions on the front of your customer that will help you to get better information. So again, this is not held up. This application is not held up for you because we're asking you for more information. The two, excuse me, Actos, and right above it, Actoplus, we talked about neuropathy, and again, those are drugs specific for that. If we were to go down and find gabapentin, gabapentin would actually list 2 different situations. So again, I encourage you to use this guide. We will update it as often as we are able, and it's just a really good piece of information for you to have to use. I encourage you, if you write business beyond Plan Right, I encourage you to use the drug guide as well, just if nothing else for purposes of knowing what a drug is for. It will help you to be a better field underwriter. So with that, let me just check really quick to see if we have any questions. And again, we do our best to answer as many questions as we can. We obviously probably won't get to all of our questions, but we'll do our best to provide as many answers as we can. And if we didn't hit a question in this particular session and it's still meaningful for you, please contact us directly and we'll try to get an answer back to you just as soon as we can. Our prescription history information goes back 7 years. And so any drug that goes 7 years, goes back 7 years or is more current than that, we will get information about. And so if that information is relative with respect to the questions that we are looking for, the questions that we are asking about, the basis of our information goes to that drug history. And as 7 years rolls forward, then those drugs roll off, but that's the basis of the prescription history. MIB as well has information that goes back 7 years. As information gets older than that, it falls off. But as we get MIB information, it does go back 7 years. And we have the difference between prescription history and MIB as far as the information is concerned. Sometimes we have a little better guidance with respect to MIB because of where the information came from and the source that coded that information. Sometimes we have to work a little bit harder to get to some details. We cannot make decisions rather based on MIB information, and sometimes we have to get your help involved and your customers' help involved in getting information from MIB, because we cannot make a decision based on that information. It is just a clue for us to be able to look for additional information. The penalties for using MIB information in your decision-making process can be as small as a fine to as big as losing the privilege to use MIB. And I can assure you I'm not having that conversation with anybody as to why we lost our privileges with MIB, so therefore we use MIB in the way that we are supposed to based on the bylaws of MIB. Prescription history, we can make decisions on prescription history information, and we do every single day. So that's the difference between those particular pieces of evidence. We're going to go to the second bullet point in our conversation, which is the importance of full disclosure. Again, on a product that is non-tested, there is no expense nor time to get medical records. It is extremely important that we have full disclosure of all the information, that we have good field underwriting that's going on. And I know by and large we really do. We have pretty excellent results with respect to the field underwriting that goes on. Oftentimes I hear about the things that didn't go so well. Unfortunately, I don't hear about those every day, so I have to assume that we're doing a pretty good job otherwise. But it's extremely important. Between MIB and prescription history, and remember a hit rate that's in the high 80s. Sometimes, depending on the state and the demographics, that hit rate goes into the 90s. If there's information out there, we're going to get it. And when the information doesn't show up on the application or is not accounted for in medical question, unfortunately that's going to take the application off the line, and it's going to cost you time and effort and frustration, quite frankly, to get the additional information that's necessary. So we encourage you to be as upfront as you can with the information you get from your customers with respect to the medical history, because chances are we're going to find out about it in some fashion. We are now to the third point of our agenda, the medical questions and prescription history. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to go into our questions and see if we have some good questions out there that we can go through. But if you do have a situation that you feel is different based on the information, we encourage you to get the medical information, send it to us, give us the information with respect to the customer, the cert number, the name, obviously, social security number, and we'll be happy to take a look at that to see if we can make a different decision. Similar question, what means is there to clarify the specific use of a drug? If you're talking about for your own education purposes, I would point you back to the prescription drug section of the underwriting guide. Here's a question, can you talk about how we can effectively deal with cases where MIB codes cause Aptical to re-ask questions when the client maintains the answer should be no? MIB is coded by one group of people and one group of people only, and that's underwriters at life insurance companies. The medical community does not code MIB. Nurses don't code to MIB, hospitals don't code to MIB, pharmacies don't code to MIB. Only those that have insurance applications sitting in front of them code back to MIB. And MIB is it's an alphanumeric code that we get, and again, because of the qualifiers that are used inside that code, it tells us what the issue is, when the issue first surfaced, where the information came from in terms of APS. Did it come from an exam? Did it come from the applicant on the application? And then when, from a time perspective, that particular problem showed up. And so when Aptical gets an MIB code where they have to ask or re-ask a question, it's because, again, that code has surfaced and it's a relevant code. Aptical verifies the code with respect to the person that they're talking to. Sometimes we get codes that are called tri-codes that are for people that have similar names, but the codes that Aptical deals with are specifically identified to that particular person. So if they do get, excuse me, if they do get a question, your customer gets a question that's re-asked because of MIB information, it's pretty solid that another company has coded that information. Now the other challenge is whether your customer knows that or not, because probably unless it's a code, an E-code that comes from the applicant, it showed up in medical records. And that's a challenge because the doctor may or may not have talked to the customer about that. Unfortunately, we have to deal with that. When your customer doesn't know about it, we may come back and send them off to Boston to get the MIB code detail. There may be something additional or different than we can do, but we do need to go through steps to get to the bottom of that particular question. From a clock standpoint, we are at about 10 minutes left. I'm going to chat just a little bit more about prescription history. And then if we have additional questions that come in, I'll keep an eye on the question part of this software and see if we can answer a few more questions. Okay. One question that just came in, is there a reason the plan right cap is at $35,000? Yes, again, to the market and to the product. This is a simplified issue product that we ask limited questions. We ask fewer questions on this particular product than we do on our non-med products or other simplified issue products, and that's really by design. And so if we were to blow this up to larger face amounts or to younger ages, we would have to redo an application, and it would look extremely similar, if not identical, to the non-med application we currently have. And so because it's a target product to a target market, that's why there are face amount limitations as well as age limitations, and we really try to hit the mark with respect to most of the folks inside of this market from an age standpoint and a face amount standpoint. We have some excellent non-med products and fully underwritten products. If 35,000 isn't enough as far as face amount is concerned, we do have other non-med products that might be an excellent opportunity for you.
And Doug, if I may jump in, that's a frequently asked question. If they're looking for a final expense, but they want more than $35,000, or they're under 50, I would recommend our alternative, which is our Advantage Plus, our participating whole life. You can write down to zero up to age 85. Minimum base amount starts at $25,000, so keep that in mind.
I've been involved with prescription drug history now for about 9 years, and it's the real deal, and it's here to stay. It's not going to go away, and it is the new MIB of evidence gathering and underwriting insurance inside the life insurance industry. So that's why it's extremely important to get as much information as you can about your customers' prescription histories and the specific drugs that they're taking. And if there's confusion about what it is that you see in front of you or what those drugs might be, give us a call and we'll be happy to chat with you about what those drugs are and what perhaps they might be used for. And again, use of the underwriting prescription section inside the underwriting guide. I encourage all of you to carry that with you. The prescription website, again, is drugs.com. Pretty simple. Put it out there in your favorites. You can actually go in and type the drug name into a search bar, and if you don't get it quite right, it'll bring up a number of choices, and go ahead and choose that drug that is the one you're looking for. And then on the left-hand side, there's a tab that is that will be what it's used for. It says indications, and that's the part of that particular website that will tell you what that particular drug is used for. And if there are dual purposes, sometimes this website does a decent job of identifying that, but there may be dual purposes out there for these drugs. And the prescription history is medical providers and the type of medical specialty that they are. I'm going to give you an example of a drug called ondansetron. Ondansetron was approved by the FDA for use in dealing with nausea for chemotherapy, and so it has kind of a bad connotation attached to it. Ondansetron, however, is also used by orthopedic surgeons for nausea either pre or post surgery, and so oftentimes you see that drug being used for that particular situation. What allows us to break apart and determine which is a good situation and which is a bad situation is the medical specialty. So if an orthopedic surgeon has prescribed ondansetron, we don't care, we move on and we go to the next one. If, however, an oncologist has prescribed ondansetron, then that is a situation that would be of concern to us. And so we have built med specialty into our drug rules, and it has helped to clear up some confusion on the dual purpose drugs. But as often as we can, we do use that med specialty. Jared, at this point, I see it's 2 o'clock. There's some questions out there about getting handouts, and I think we've talked about the fact that this has been recorded and will be available at a later time. Let's see. The risk assessment hotline, there's a question about risk assessment hotline. We encourage you to call the sales desk with respect to those calls. The sales desk do engage us if necessary in terms of getting underwriting guidance or underwriting direction. I think at this juncture, I think that's all we have time for. Again, I would encourage you, if we didn't get your question answered and you would like an answer to that, I encourage you to contact me, and I'll either get back to you directly or I'll have one of my team members get back to you and we'll get that answer for you. We appreciate your time and appreciate your business. Thanks very much.